Scandinavian Scotland refers to the period from the 8th to the 15th centuries during which Vikings and Norse settlers, mainly Norwegians and to a smaller extent other Scandinavians, and their descendants colonised parts of what is now the periphery of modern Scotland. Viking influence in the area commenced in the late 8th century, and hostility between the Scandinavian Earls of Orkney and the emerging thalassocracy of the Kingdom of the Isles, the rulers of Ireland, Dál Riata and Alba, and intervention by the Crown of Norway were recurring themes. Scandinavian-held territories included the northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland, the Hebrides, the islands of the Firth of Clyde and associated mainland territories including Caithness and Sutherland. The historical record from Scottish sources is weak, with the Irish annals and the later Norse sagas, of which the Orkneyinga Saga is the principal source of information, sometimes contradictory, although modern archaeology is beginning to provide a broader picture of life during this period. There are various competing theories that have addressed the early colonization process, although it is clear that the Northern Isles were the first to be conquered by Vikings and the last to be relinquished by the Norwegian crown. Thorfinn Sigurdsson's rule in the 11th century included expansion well into North Mainland Scotland, and this may have been the zenith of Scandinavian influence. The obliteration of pre-Norse names in the Hebrides and the replacement with Norse ones was almost total, although the emergence of alliances with the native Gaelic speakers produced a powerful Norse Gael culture that had wide influence in Argyll, Galloway and beyond. Scottish influence increased from the 13th century on. In 1231 an unbroken line of Norse Earls of Orkney ended, and the title was henceforward held by Scots nobles. An ill-fated expedition by Haakon Harkonus and later in that century led to the relinquishing of the islands of the west to the Scottish crown, and in the mid-15th century Orkney and Shetland were also transferred to Scottish rule. The negative view of Viking activities held in popular imagination notwithstanding, Norse expansion may have been a factor in the emergence of the Gaelic kingdom of Alba, the forerunner of modern Scotland, and the trading, political, cultural and religious achievements of the later periods of Norse rule were significant. Geography. The Northern Isles, known to the Norse as the Norðreyjar, are the closest parts of the United Kingdom to Norway, and these islands experienced the first and most long-lasting Norse influence of any part of Scotland. Shetland is some 300 kilometers due west of Norway and in favorable conditions could be reached in 24 hours from Hordaland in a Viking longship. Orkney is 80 kilometers further to the southwest. Some 16 kilometers due south of Orkney is the Scottish mainland. The two most northerly provinces of mainland Scotland, Caithness and Sutherland, fell under Norse control at an early date. South of the entire western seaboard of mainland Scotland from west to Ross to Kintyre was also subject to significant Scandinavian influence. The Southreyjar, or Southern Isles, include the Hebrides, or Western Isles comprising the Outer Hebrides, aka the Long Island, to the west, separated from the northern Inner Hebrides by the waters of the Minch. These islands are some 180 kilometers west of Orkney. The Inner Hebrides, including Skye, Islay, Jura, Mull and Iona, the islands of the Firth of Clyde, some 140 kilometers to the south, the largest of which are Bute and Arran. The Isle of Man, located in the Irish Sea equidistantly from modern England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. The total distance from the southern tip of the Isle of Man to the Butt of Lewis, the northern extremity of the Outer Hebrides, is approximately 515 kilometers. This entire region became dominated by Norse culture for much of the period under consideration. For example, it is likely that the Norse language became as dominant throughout the Inner Hebrides as it did on Lewis during the 10th and 11th centuries. There was also significant direct Norse influence exerted in Galloway in southwest Scotland and for much of the period, up until the 1266 Treaty of Perth. Norwegian and Danish foreign policy and the activities of independent or semi-independent Norse rulers of the above parts of Scandinavian dominated. Scotland had a powerful influence on the affairs of Scotland as a whole. Colonization process. Scholarly interpretations of the period have led to widely divergent reconstructions of Viking Age Scotland, especially in the early period, and Barrett has identified 4 competing theories, none of which he regards as proven. The traditional explanation is the Earldom Hypothesis. This assumes a period of Norse expansion into the Northern Isles and the creation of an aristocratic dynasty that lasted well into the medieval period, which exerted considerable influence in western Scotland and Man into the 11th century. This version of events is essentially as told by the Norse sagas and is supported by some archaeological evidence, although it has been criticized for exaggerating Orcadian influence in the southern area. The second of these theories is the Genocide Hypothesis, which asserts that the aboriginal populations of the Northern and Western Isles were eradicated and replaced wholesale with settlers of Scandinavian stock. The strength of this argument is the almost total replacement of pre-existing place names by those of Norse origin throughout much of the region. Its weakness is that the place name evidence is from a relatively late date, and the nature of this transition remains controversial. Genetic studies show the Shetlanders have almost identical proportions of Scandinavian matrilineal and patrilineal ancestry, suggesting that the islands were settled by both men and women in equal measure. The pagan reaction hypothesis proposed by Bjorn Mhyre suggests a long tradition of mobility amongst the various populations of the North Atlantic seaboard, and that the expansion of Christian missions resulted in ethnic tensions that led to or exacerbated Viking expansion. There is some evidence of such mobility, such as Irish missionary activities in Iceland and the Faroes in the 8th century, but little that is conclusive. The fourth suggestion is the Laithlinder-Lochlin hypothesis. This word appears in various forms in the early Irish literature and is usually assumed to refer to Norway itself, although some have preferred to locate it in the Norse-dominated parts of Scotland. Donchard O'Caraine is a proponent of this view and claims that a substantial part of Scotland, the Northern and Western Isles and large areas of the coastal mainland, were conquered by the Vikings in the first quarter of the 9th century, and that a Viking kingdom was set up there earlier than the middle of the century. Essentially a variant of the Earldom hypothesis, there is little archaeological evidence in its favor, although it is clear that extensive Viking incursions on the Irish coasts were supported by a presence of some kind in the Hebrides, even if the date the latter became prominent is far from certain, as O'Caraine himself admits. When and how the Vikings conquered and occupied the Isles is unknown, perhaps unknowable. Early Viking incursions. Norse contacts with Scotland certainly predate the first written records in the 8th century, although their nature and frequency are unknown. Excavations at Norwich on the island of Unst in Shetland indicate that Scandinavian settlers had reached there, perhaps as early as the mid-7th century, consistent with dates produced for Viking levels at Old Scatness. From 793 onwards, repeated raids by Vikings on the British Isles are recorded. All the islands of Britain were devastated in 794, with Iona being sacked in 802 and 806. Various named Viking leaders, who were probably based in Scotland, appear in the Irish annals. Sogsulf in 837, Turges in 845 and Haakon in 847. The king of Fortri Eogan mac Ingusa and the king of Dál Riata and Alba were among the dead in a major defeat to the Vikings in 839. Another early reference to the Norse presence in the Irish records is that there was a king of Viking Scotland whose heir, Thorir, brought an army to Ireland in 848. Ceathlfine was a reported leader of the Gulgwidel fighting in Ireland in 857. The Frankish Annalbertiniani may record the conquest of the Inner Hebrides by Vikings in 847. Amlabe Conung, who died in 874, is described as the son of the king of Lochlin in the fragmentary annals of Ireland, also suggesting an early date for an organized kingdom of Viking Scotland. In the same source, Amlabe is also recorded as having gone to the aid of his father Gofraid, who was under assault from Vikings in Lochlin, circa 872. Gofraid died in 873 and may have been succeeded by his son Iamar, who also died that year. A lament for Aed mac Sinada, a Pictish king who died in 878, suggests Kintyre may have been lost to his kingdom at the time. The Isle of Man may also have been taken by the Norse in 877 and was certainly held by them by 900. Northraya. The Northern Isles were Pictish in culture and speech prior to the Norse incursions, and although it is recorded that Orkney was destroyed by King Bride in 682, it is not likely that the Pictish kings exerted a significant degree of ongoing control over island affairs. According to the Orkneyinga Saga, about 872, Harald Fairhair became king of a united Norway and many of his opponents fled to the islands of Scotland. Harald pursued his enemies and incorporated the Northern Isles into his kingdom in 875, and then, perhaps a little over a decade later, the Hebrides as well. The following year, the local Viking chieftains of the Hebrides rebelled. Harald then sent Ceathlflatnes to subdue them. Ketil achieved this quickly but then declared himself an independent king of the Isles, a title he retained for the rest of his life. Hunter states that Ketil was in charge of an extensive island realm and, as a result, sufficiently prestigious to contemplate the making of agreements and alliances with other princelings. According to the landname Abok, Ketil became ruler of a region already settled by Scandinavians. Some scholars believe that this entire story is apocryphal and based on the later voyages of Magnus Berlegs. For example, Wolf suggests that his appearance in the sagas looks very much like a story created in later days to legitimize Norwegian claims to sovereignty in the region, and suggests an early 11th century creation of the Earldom of Orkney, prior to which local warlords competed for influence with one another and local populations of farmers. Nonetheless, the Norse tradition states that Rognvald Steinson received Orkney and Shetland from Harald as an earldom as reparation for the death of his son in battle in Scotland, and then passed the earldom on to his brother Sigurd the Mighty. Sigurd's line barely survived him, and it was Torfeinar, Rognvald's son by a slave, who founded a dynasty that controlled the Northern Isles for centuries after his death. He was succeeded by his son Thorfinn Turfeinarsson, and during this time the deposed Norwegian king Erik Bloodaxe often used Orkney as a raiding base before being killed in 954. Thorfinn's death and presumed burial at the Broch of Hoxa, on South Ronaldsay, then led to a long period of dynastic strife. Whatever the historical details, it seems likely that Orkney and Shetland were being rapidly absorbed into Norse culture by this time. The evidence of toponymy and language is unequivocal. Place names in Orkney with a Celtic derivation are few in number, and it is clear that Norn, a local version of Old Norse, was widely spoken by the inhabitants into historic times. Norn was also spoken in Shetland, and evidence for Pictish elements in place names is virtually non-existent. The three island names of Fetla, Unst and Yell accepted. Jarlshof in Shetland contains the most extensive remains of a Viking site visible anywhere in Britain, and it is believed that the Norse inhabited the site continuously from the 9th to the 14th centuries. Amongst the many important finds are drawings scratched on slate of dragon-prowed ships and a bronze-gilt harness mounting made in Ireland in the 8th and 9th centuries. Broth of Bursey in Orkney is another important archaeological site, which like Jarlshof has a continuity of settlement spanning the Pictish and Norse periods. There is a remarkable collection of 12th century runic inscriptions inside Maze How. Caithness and Sutherland. In early Irish literature, Shetland is referred to as Inscat, the Isles of Cats, which may have been the pre-Norse inhabitants' name for these islands. The Cat tribe certainly occupied parts of the northern Scottish mainland, and the name can be found in Caithness, and in the Gaelic name for Sutherland. There is limited evidence that Caithness may have had an intermediate phase of Gaelic-speaking control between the Pictish era and the Norse takeover, but if it existed, it is likely to have been short-lived. Sigurd I Steinson and Thorstein the Red moved on northern Scotland, conquering large areas variously described in the sagas as constituting all of Caithness and Sutherland, and possibly including territory in Ross, and even Moray during the last decade of the 9th century. The Orkneyinga Saga relates how the former defeated the picked male Brigte Tusk but died from an unusual post-battle injury. Thorfinn Thorfinnarson married into the native aristocracy, and his son, Skarli Thorfinnsson, is recorded as having sought the support of the King of Scots in the 10th century in pursuing his claim as Mormar of Caithness. NJAL Saga relates that Sigurd the Stout was the ruler of Ross and Moray, Sutherland and the Dales of Caithness, and it is possible that in the late 10th century the Scots kings were in alliance with the Earl of Orkney against the Mormar of Moray. Thorfinn Sigurdsson expanded his father's realm south beyond Sutherland, and by the 11th century the Norwegian crown had come to accept that Caithness was held by the Earls of Orkney as a fiefdom from the kings of Scotland, although its Norse character was retained throughout the 13th century. Ragnall mac Gofraid was granted Caithness after assisting the Scots king in a conflict with Harold Madadson, an Earl of Orkney, in the early 13th century. This joint earldom ceased after 1375, and the Pentland Firth became the border between Scotland and Norway. No Norse place names have been found on the northern Scottish mainland south of Beaulieu, and so far no archaeological evidence of Norse activity has been found in the northwest mainland. Southraya. Like the Northern Isles, the Outer Hebrides and the Northern Inner Hebrides were predominantly Pictish in the early 9th century. By contrast, the Southern Inner Hebrides formed part of the Gaelic kingdom of Dál Riata. The obliteration of pre-Norse names in the Outer Hebrides and in Col, Tyre and Islay in the Inner Hebrides is almost total, and there is little continuity of style between Pictish pottery in the north and that of the Viking period. The similarities that do exist suggests the later pots may have been made by Norse who had settled in Ireland, or Irish slaves. There are frequent references in early Icelandic history to slaves from Ireland and the Hebrides, but none from Orkney. Gaelic certainly continued to exist as a spoken language in the Southern Hebrides throughout the settlement period, but place name evidence suggests it had a lowly status, and Norse may have survived as a spoken language until the 16th century in the Outer Hebrides. There is no evidence of any direct Norwegian rule in the area other than a few brief occupations, although the written record is weak in number. Contemporary records of the Norse period from the Outer Hebrides exist. It is however known that Hebrides were taxed using the Ansland system, and evidence from Borneo suggests that settlers there may have been more prosperous than families of a similar status in the Northern Isles, possibly due to a more relaxed political regime. Latterly, the Hebrides sent 8 representatives from Lewis and Harris and Skye and another 8 from the Southern Hebrides to the Tynwald Parliament on Man. Colonsay and Oronsay have produced important pagan Norse burial grounds. An 11th century crossed slab decorated with Irish and ring-like Viking art on Islay was found in 1838. Ruver and Danane, today an uninhabited peninsula to the south of the Cuillin Hills on Skye, contains the small Loch Narachad, which is connected to the sea by a short artificial canal. This loch was an important site for maritime activity for many centuries, spanning the Viking and later periods of Scottish clan rule. There is a stone-built quay and a system to maintain constant water levels. Boat timbers discovered there have been dated to the 12th century. Only 3 rune stones are known from the west coast of Scotland, on Christian memorials found on Barra, Inchmarnock and Iona. In the Firth of Clyde, Norse burials have been found on Arran, although not butte and place name evidence suggests a settlement pattern that was much less well developed than in the Hebrides. On the mainland coast there is a cluster of Norse place names around logs, and an ornate silver brooch was found on a hillside near Hunterston that is, if likely 7th century Irish origin but with a 10th century runic inscription. 5 hogback monuments found in Govan hint at Scandinavian enclaves inland. The Isle of Man was dominated by the Norse Gaels from an early date and from 1079 onwards by the Crovan dynasty, as attested by the chronicles of Man and evidence by the numerous Manx runestones and Norse place names. The modern-day diocese of Sodor and Man retains the centuries-old name, Coastland of the Gael. South of Sutherland there is considerable place name evidence of Norse settlement along the entire western coast, although unlike on the islands the settlement in the south seems to have been less prolonged and undertaken in tandem with pre-existing settlement, rather than replacing it entirely. The distinction between the Innsgore and the Aragoidal is further suggestive of a distinction between island and mainland at an early date. In Westeros, most of the Gaelic names that exist on the coastline today are of likely medieval rather than pre-Norse origin and are now lost. Charter refers to the mainland village of Glenelg opposite Skye as having been in the possession of the King of Man. As in Orkney and Shetland, Pictish seems to have been entirely replaced wherever the Norse encountered it. In the 9th century the first references to the Gaelgweidel appear. This term was variously used in succeeding centuries to refer to individuals of mixed Scandinavian Celtic descent and/or culture or who became dominant in West and Southwest Scotland, parts of northern England and the Isles. This alliance between the two cultures, which also took place in Ireland, may have been instrumental in saving the Gaels of Dál Riata from the fate of the Picts in the north and west. Evidence for Norse settlement in mainland Argyll is limited, although the Port and Ellen Mhoi ship burial in Ard near Merkin is the first boat burial site to be discovered on the mainland of Britain. Southwest Scotland. By the mid-10th century Amlaib Gwaran controlled the Rins, and the region gets the modern name of Galloway from the mixture of Viking and Gaelic Irish settlement that produced the Gaelgweidel. Magnus Bearlegs is said to have subdued the people of Galloway in the 11th century, and Whithorn seems to have been a centre of Hiberno-Norse artisans who traded around the Irish Sea by the end of the first millennium. However, the place place name, written and archaeological evidence of extensive Norse settlement in the area is not convincing. The Ansland system seems to have become widespread down the west coast, including much of Argyll, and this is just as true of most of the southwest. Apart from land adjacent to the inner Solway Firth, in Dumfries and Galloway, the place name evidence is complex and of mixed Gaelic, Norse and Danish influence, the last most likely stemming from contact with the extensive Danish holdings in northern England. One feature of the area is the number of names with a kirk prefix followed by a saint's name such as Kirkoswald. Interpretation of this is not certain, but it is also indicative of a mixed Gaelic, Norse population. Eastern Scotland. There is no evidence of permanent Viking settlement on the east coast south of the Moray Firth, or of Norse burials, although raids and even invasions certainly occurred. Dunnottar was taken during the reign of Domhnall mac Corsyntin, and the Orkneyinga Saga records an attack on the Isle of May by Sweyn Aslefson and Margaret Grimson. They sailed south off Scotland until they came to Mayar. There was a monastery, the head of which was an abbot by name Baldwin. Sweyn and his men were detained the 7 nights by stress of bad weather. They said they had been sent by Earl Rognvald to the King of Scots. The monks suspected the tale, and thinking they were pirates, sent to the mainland for men. When Sweyn and his comrades became aware of this, they went hastily aboard the ship, after having plundered much treasure from the monastery. Place name evidence of Scandinavian settlement is very limited on the east coast, and in the southeast Anglian was the predominant influence during this period of history.